What we've seen and what a lied is, which is a song in German, it's that simple. We've seen it evolve from short, simple settings of one note to each syllable, where the singer could even accompany him or herself at the piano. We've seen the vocal lines evolve into a highly memorable tunefulness, or the most powerful declamation. We've seen the piano parts grow in importance, size, and emotional content. The entire musical language, with its increasing chromaticism and polyphonic lines, is reflective of the increasing intensity of emotions entering the lied. The Enlightenment in the latter part of the 18th century reflected optimism, that society could solve its problems through reason, logic, and science. Its art and music reflected that positive outlook. As Europe grew more industrialized and urban, artists and thinkers in all media began to seek a higher world. They yearned to go beyond the known. They desired the infinite, the transcendent. They saw themselves as wanderers on a spiritual journey, an inner quest, seeking a spiritual home. Many of them elevated nature to the status of a religion. Nearly all of them believed music to be the highest, best means to a higher world in the arts. In the aftermath of the violent portion of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Restoration after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the artists and intellectuals withdrew inwards, and art and thought became more to console the individual rather than to save society. But it was usually in a hopeful, optimistic manner. But after the failed 1848 revolutions throughout much of Europe, great pessimism and disillusionment set in. We think of Romanticism spanning the entire 19th century, but there were many phases of Romanticism, and the earlier true Romanticism was mostly gone by 1850. What now developed was a resignation, an introspection, and a nostalgia. This is the background for the leader we hear tonight. I'd like to make a few comments about Brahms as a person, as well as his leader. Brahms was solitary above all. He habitually kept feelings to himself. Clara Schumann said that in nearly 50 years of knowing him, she had, quote, no insight into his character or ways of thinking. He was hypersensitive and moody even in childhood and had a way of avoiding really close relations with people. He was not skilled at communicating diplomatically and sometimes prided himself in being cantankerous. He immersed himself fully in his work. He was up at 5 a.m. habitually, had his strong black coffee, which he continued drinking through the day, worked until midday, ate at the same restaurant, the Red Hedgehog, for the last 14 years of his life. When he was not composing, he engaged in solitary pursuits, spending much time reading. He knew the work of all the poets and writers and could converse with the leading intellectuals of his day. He was especially proud of his collection of rare books, scores, and manuscripts. He liked to take long walks. He traveled in the summers and stayed in simple, modest inns. He lived simply, refusing to ever dress up. He seemed to identify with Beethoven and Schubert as a lonely, somewhat eccentric genius. He was obviously obsessive-compulsive and occasionally irritable, especially as he grew older. But Brahms was extremely helpful to many other musicians, and actually to anyone who needed help, and he was especially kind to children. He was not an easy man to figure out, and this was not helped by the fact that he was so private that he destroyed most of his personal documents or ordered them to be destroyed. This is also true of his compositions. We would have so many more had he not destroyed so many. Over half of Brahms' total output was for voice. This includes 250 solo lieder, 50 folk songs, and 80 duets and quartets. They have been called the jewels of his life's work. They were written through every period of his life, though an especially large number were written between the ages of 35 and 41. He was a choral conductor by profession and was attracted to several women who were singers and actually engaged to one for a period of time. His lieder are generally melancholy and often deal with death, tears, unrequited or lost love, nostalgia for the past, especially for childhood, and nature. They are frequently in minor keys. Their dark, rich beauty makes them especially well suited to lower voices. Melody is the dominant element and usually within a narrow range. Often triadic, they frequently resemble folk songs. This is not surprising since Brahms worked a great deal with folk songs. A long legato line is a prerequisite to sing his lieder well. Brahms responded mostly to the general mood of the poem and not to the specifics of the poetry. He was more interested in setting a scene than setting words, and sometimes the accentuation of the words does not match the accentuation of the music. He showed little interest in illustrating details of the text, making his lieder border on being absolute music, where Hugo Wolf's aspired to the condition of poetry or recitative. The majority of Brahms' lieder are strophic, which means using the same music for each verse, if we include varied strophic settings. Many are in a simple ABA form, and they're not usually through composed, meaning the different music for each verse. The piano parts are often very independent of the voice and are very polyphonic, meaning multiple independent melodic lines. The bass melodic line is so incredibly important in Brahms' writing, in the lieder, as well as, I feel, in all of his music. Composing lieder clearly influenced the writing of Brahms' instrumental works, since every genre that he wrote in has lyricism at its heart. That suppleness stems in part from Brahms being such a prolific lieder composer.
So we've prepared a set of, to start with, 4 Brahms pieces. Auf dem Kirchhofe is a piece where the character is in the cemetery on a dark and stormy night and is looking at the old headstones and crosses, and he's saying that on those stones is frozen the word gewesen, we were. And then Brahms writes something inspired from St. Matthew Passion's Passion Chorale, and if you are all at all familiar with that, you will be able to recognize it. And that's sort of the each stone thawing out, and in the thawing, the character can now see the words genesen, or healed. And in the second piece, O wüsste ich doch den Weg zurück, the person is longing for childhood. It says, oh, why did I ever leave my mother's hand? It was so lovely, all these things about childhood. And why did I go searching for something else than that comfort when all I see around me now is empty beach? Finally, in the last 2, Vergebliches Ständchen and Von ewiger Liebe are both conversational pieces. In conversational pieces, I should say, between a boy and a girl. In Vergebliches Ständchen, a boy has arrived at a girl's door and said, hey, it's cold outside, let me in, and the girl says, my mother's warned me about you. No, I'm not going to let you in, or she'll have my hide. And the piece kind of ends with her slamming the door in his face. And in Von ewiger Liebe, it's quite a different conversation. It's also a dark night. I guess Brahms loved dark, stormy nights. But a young man is escorting his beloved home. And we don't know why they're having this conversation, but there must have been a moment before where that leads him to say, if you're suffering on account of me, if you'll endure ridicule because of me, let's just end this, let's call this whole thing off. And she says, no, nothing can break our love. Iron and steel are very strong, but our love is stronger still.
have in front of you will be the last time in this series that we're comparing two texts set by two different composers. And in line with all the things that George pointed out in his opening about the differences in the ways in which Brahms and Wolf is where we're going next, the ways in which Brahms and Wolf set their text, we hope that you'll be able to pick up on some of these things as you listen to the next two pieces. So this is In dem Schatten meiner Locken. I really love the text of this piece because the picture that it paints in my head is that a woman's beloved has fallen asleep in the shadow of her hair. And I guess that I'm reading into it if I say that he's fallen asleep on her hair, but the picture that it paints is that he's fallen asleep right here and she can't move. And she's sort of saying, should I wake him up now? Oh, nine. No. Because if I wake him up, then I'll have to hear him complain about this is hard to translate on the spot. But if I wake him up, then I'll have to hear him complain about how much I make him suffer, about how much he's at my beck and call kind of thing. And the first verse, I went on to the second verse, but in the first verse, she says she's very frustrated because every day she takes care of her hair very well, and she brushes her hair every day, and then she goes out and the wind completely destroys her hair, but now that same hair has lulled her beloved to sleep. The same kind of wind-blown hair has lulled her beloved to sleep. Should I wake him now? Ah, nine. So, interestingly enough, Brahms sets this piece in a minor key. Wolf sets it in a major key. Brahms tends to emphasize words that are not so important. For example, in the first line, in dem Schatten meiner, in is not so important, right? Whereas Hugo Wolf says, in dem Schatten meiner Locken, so it makes a bigger deal out of the shadow of my hair. So you'll see that Wolf takes great care in every little word and every little note and the really small details of the poetry, whereas I think that Brahms painted with a little bit of a bigger picture, bigger musical ideas. So this is In dem Schatten meiner Locken. In dem Schatten meiner Locken schlief mir mein Geliebter ein. Weck ihn nun auf, ach nein,
Hugo Wolf's Lieder have been termed the zenith of Lieder. They have been described as some of the most highly organized and exquisitely felt, woundingly beautiful songs ever given to the world. Lieder aficionados treasure them deeply, but because he wrote only Lieder, he's far too little known. I would like to talk rather extensively because of this fact. When we perform his Lieder, they're all short, so don't fear that we will run as long as we did on the first half on Sunday night. In fact, the whole concert is a little shorter tonight than on Sunday night. Wolf was born in 1860 in Lower Styria, Austria, which is actually today Yugoslavia. His family was mainly of German origin, though there may have been a little bit of Slovene blood on his very temperamental mother's side. He showed major music ability at a young age and went to the Vienna Conservatory in his teenage years, but he was expelled because of discipline problems. But he was determined to stay in Vienna, which he did the rest of his life. He was basically self-taught and really lived a pretty much hand-to-mouth existence, especially in his student age years. He was a huge, huge admirer of Wagner, and the few stories that relate to that, one of them was even when he was 16, Wagner was coming to town for the performance of one of the operas, and he was so determined to get to Wagner that he actually managed to convince the hotel people to get him access to Wagner's room. But before doing that, he would appear at the door and open the door for Wagner as Wagner would come out to get into his carriage and then race over and beat the carriage to the opera house and get out and open the door again. So that Wagner got quite used to seeing him. So when he actually appeared outside the door of the hotel room, Wagner said, "Oh, I've seen you before." And he said, "What would you like?" And then little Wolf said, "Well, I want you to look at my compositions." And Wagner said, "Well, these are piano pieces, and I don't know anything about piano music, but why don't you come do some other compositions and come back when I'm in Vienna in the future?" And Hugo Wolf was very, very happy that he'd been encouraged in that way. He then went out and bought a huge bust of Wagner with the little money that he had. In fact, when he went off for a position in Salzburg that only lasted a few months because of his difficult disposition, he was to help in the opera house there. The only thing he really had to take with him was this huge bust of Wagner that was in his little knapsack at the time. But he became a huge partisan for Wagner. We often forget today that there was a huge musical war going on in the 1860s, 1870s. It was really the more conservative school of Clara Schumann, Brahms, the famous critic Hanslick in Vienna, versus the Wagnerians and the Lisztians. It assumed practically violent proportions. Everybody felt they had to be in one camp or the other instead of simply enjoying both. And the feelings ran very, very hard. So Hanslick was the powerful critic, and Vienna has traditionally been quite conservative. They didn't like Liszt and were so suspicious of the Wagner type of writing. So Wolf figured somebody has to write somewhere in behalf of Wagner. So he got himself a job when he was 24 as a music critic, and it was not for a major paper, but he became the rage in Vienna because people couldn't wait to buy that paper to see the vitriolic comments that were being made against Brahms and the more conservative music on behalf of the Wagnerian side of things. They even referred to the wild wolf in Hugo Wolf. And actually, when we read some of that, initially one's put off because we figure, how could he not appreciate Brahms? But he loved Von Ewige Liebe, for instance. He isolated the various Brahms pieces he did relate to and like. In other ways, what he was really saying was Brahms wasn't adding a whole lot new, where Liszt and Wagner were going in new directions, and he was simply sympathizing with the pioneering efforts that were being made rather than the masterful realizations of a more conservative idiom. There is the little known fact also, he went to Brahms also when he was about 19, and Brahms received him very warmly, and then he wanted to show him his compositions. And Wolf at this age was not that advanced as a composer, and Brahms said, well, you need a lot of instruction, young man, and Wolf wasn't too pleased to hear that. But Brahms, to his credit, never got drawn into this in a way that he became personally involved. He would sort of laugh and say, well, I wonder what the Wolf is saying about me this week, and then go off to read the reviews that were there. Wolf composed from 1877 till 1887, 10 years or so, and wrote some songs. They weren't spectacular pieces, and we don't hear them today. But they managed to get published, and suddenly he felt confident. And then he discovered early in 1888, when he was 28, the poetry of Edward Murica. Murica was a modest, well-adjusted man, a Lutheran pastor and professor with a classical background. His poems are quite simple, natural, unpretentious, and almost folk songs. They had an intimacy. They had definite images from his being so observant. It was as if he had a painter's eye. The poems were nostalgic, but never maudlin. They were frequently humorous and described fantasy, the supernatural world, fairy tales. He wrote of elves, he wrote of mice, he wrote of archetypal figures, village maidens, lovesick boys, old women. Murica was not famous until Wolf said his poetry, and it was Murica who really brought out of Wolf the potential he had in him. Wolf devoted himself fanatically to Murica and set a pattern for all his future composing. He would go into seclusion in one of the villages near Vienna and work from 6 a.m. until late at night, often skipping any eating and certainly any exercise. No visitors were allowed, and he went out and killed any birds that were distracting him. He was feeling, quote, ecstatic clairvoyance and was amazed how the songs came out. He said he just didn't know how it happened. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 a day. Only on one occasion did he work on a song for more than one day. Between February and May of 1888, he'd written 43 lieder, all on Murica poetry. He would later add 10 more in October, totaling 53 magnificent Murica settings. We will perform 3 of the Murica lieder, Das Verlassene Mägdlein, the first one, and then the Verschwiegene Liebe in Abschied, the third and the fourth. And this shows a cross-section of Murica, from the empathy with deep despair to humor. In September 1888, Wolf set 13 Eichendorff poems to add to the 7 he'd written earlier in his life. Most of his Eichendorff settings describe people rather than nature poetry, with the transcendence and mysticism that Schumann had set many of earlier. Actually, though, Verschwiegene Liebe, which we'll perform tonight, is one of those few elegiac nature poems of Eichendorff that Wolf set. In October of 1888, Wolf entered Goethe's world, and the next 180 days produced 51 songs on Goethe texts. He'd now written 123 songs in 1 year. Just as the Eichendorff settings are entirely different from the Murica, the Goethe settings are worlds different from the settings of the other poets. Goethe's being serious and profound brought out some of Wolf's most serious, massive, heavy writing. They are not Wolf's most lyrical writing, but they are perfectly suited to Goethe's poetry. As Frank Walker has written, the Goethe settings embody the grandeur of a giant mountain, whereas the Murica settings are like mellow country life. The Mignon lied, Kennst du das Land, that you heard Friday night, was a Goethe selection. Heise's extremely popular translations of 16th and 17th century Spanish poetry stimulated Wolf to set 10 sacred and 34 secular poems. These 44 works, written over 6 months, comprise the Spanisches Liederbuch. Again, they reflect the sources of the poetry and bear little resemblance to any other of Wolf's groups of settings. Like sacred Spanish art, his settings of the sacred poems are very austere. We actually aren't performing any tonight. The secular poems are given much vitality in a Spanish atmosphere, and you heard one of those within Dem Schatten. Next, he produced 22 songs based on Heise's translations of Italian poetry. But then he stopped. Between December of 1891 and March of 1896, no songs were written. He'd written 211 in the 46 months previous to this, but there would be none for these nearly 4.5 years. He was miserable that he could just not find the inspiration. During this time, he did search for an opera libretto, and finally in 1895 wrote Der Corregidor in 3 months' time. It was a failure. We often forget also the amount of time Schubert spent writing operas. He wrote 15 of them. Only 3 of them were actually performed, and those were failures. But if you count up the number of measures that Schubert wrote, he wrote more of opera than any other genre. Of course, opera was the vehicle to success in those days, so it was financial success and more prestige if you could succeed. But both those composers weren't really opera composers. There wasn't the dramatic tension sustained for multiple hours, and then also the fact they were working from really pathetic librettos. And the libretto does have something to do with an opera, as we all know. Early in 1896, Wolf added 20 more Italian songs in a few months' time, which brings it to 42, I believe. And then, looking at your programs, we'll be doing O Ver dein Haus and Wenn du mein Liebster, both from the Italian songbook. So what we've represented tonight, except for the sacred part of the Spanish book, we've got some of everybody. We've got 3 of America. We had Goethe back on Friday night. We've got an Eichendorff tonight. We've got a secular Spanish book, and we've got some Italian Liederbuch. In September 1896, he set 2 Reinecke poems, including Morgenstimmung. That will be our last selection of Wolf tonight. He did then continue to write 3 songs and poems of Michelangelo. He actually thought these were his best works. They're very austere settings and seem themselves to be carved out of marble. In the fall of 1897, when Wolf was 37, he exhibited very weird behavior, confusion, hallucinations. This was from the syphilis he'd acquired when he was age 17, probably at a Viennese brothel. In October of 98, he threw himself into a lake and actually survived and then was institutionalized for life. Paralysis set in, and it was a nightmare experience. Eventually, he couldn't speak, see, or hear. He died in February of 1903 and is buried in that magnificent pantheon of the Central Cemetery in Vienna, with Beethoven, with Schubert, and with Brahms. Interestingly enough, Brahms and Wolf just lie a few feet from each other. And it's almost eerie. You're walking around a corner there, and there's, on the headstone, it is a sculpture of Wolf's face that is full of intensity. He certainly belongs with those composers. What was he like as a person? He was intense from day one, but he was popular in childhood because he could be amusing to others and was an astounding mimic. Chopin was also quite a mimic. Wolf was 5'1" as an adult and small-figured. He had a thin mustache and a goatee, which he had a habit of pulling hairs out of. His eyes were often noted by others, some perceiving grief in them and others seeing them, quote, as maniacal and piercing. He had a quick, jerky walk, talked to himself all the time, and was famous for his constant profanity. As to his personality, he believed he was on earth for one purpose, to compose. Thus, he was very self-centered. With people he liked, he could be humorous and had a unique charm when he chose to use it. But he was so blatantly honest and candid and never minced words. It didn't make him popular with many. He was frequently sarcastic and capable of saying malicious things. Quotes that he said about himself: "My disposition is and always will be a thoroughly morbid one. I harbor legions of devils inside me. I am not fit for society. It is my lot to grieve everyone who loves me and is dear to me." These were not said right at the end of his life. They were before that. He was often ungrateful to those who sang his songs or tried to promote his music. He would, in a concert, in a rage, stop the singers he was accompanying, criticize them out loud, and make them start over. He so insulted the singers preparing for the premiere of his opera that they found ways to sabotage its success. He was difficult with publishers, rudely fussing about every detail, refusing to allow publication of song transpositions, being unwilling to submit a picture of himself or any biographical information for publicity, saying the songs should become successful on their own merits. Who did he get along with? He was in a Viennese circle of writers, doctors, university professors, government officials, and wealthy businessmen who supported him. They gave him places to live, money to publish his works, and tolerated his behavior. Wolf was in love with a married woman for many years who understood him. This was a very hidden and complex relationship. He lived a Spartan life, subsisting mainly on strong black coffee, homemade cigarettes, bread, cheese, and occasionally, as a special treat, a highly seasoned sausage. He was brought up a Catholic, but turned himself, quote, an unbeliever. He adored nature and spent much time walking in it and contemplating it. It must have been quite an experience to hear Wolf perform his works. He insisted on always reading the poem first and calling attention to especially beautiful passages. One audience member wrote, quote, "Never in my life have I heard such reading. It was as if he had transubstantiated himself with all of his body into the words of the poet. The gleaming hands and the threatening eyes we saw seemed to be no longer his, but were the hands and eyes of the words. His piano playing was powerful, but also had charm. I find it amusing that when, as a teenager, he was asked to play at a wedding, and his choice was the Berlioz March to the Scaffold from Symphonie Fantastique. Well, that's not all. He played it so terrifyingly that the bride collapsed in a swoon. And actually, I had hoped that we could prepare Der Feuerreiter for the concert tonight, which I think is the most terrifying music I've ever encountered. And you can listen to it on YouTube with Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. But it's a very, very difficult piano part that I look forward to playing, but with all the other Lieder we're doing at this time, and we only knew we were going to do this concert 3 months ago, so that's going to have to wait a different time. But sometime listen to that. It is absolute terror with an absolutely devastating conclusion as well. Only Wolf could have written that. On Wolf's songs, what makes his Lieder so special? I have a number of points on that, 11 of them. 1, deep insight into the psychology of each individual poem, like a Shakespeare. Wolf said, the first principle of art for me is inexorable, harsh, strong truth to the point of terror. 2, there is a different language, world, and atmosphere for each poet. In a few bars, you know whether it's for Murica, Goethe, the Italian book, and so on. It just couldn't be one of the others. 3, he finds a different individual language for each poem. Each is unique. He uses different musical gestures and figures for moods, which would be handled so similarly by many other composers. With Wolf, that specific character or situation gets its own realization. It's not generic grief or generic joy. 4, he paints scenes and moods so realistically and vividly. It's like a picture. 5, his powerful intensity results in what are actually miniature music dramas. 6, humor was used more frequently in his Lieder than before him. 7, the breadth and variety of poems he set. Again, it's a Shakespearean similarity. He set everything in life and nature. Lovers, rogues, soldiers, sailors, hunters, musicians, philosophers, figures from antiquity, scornful women, elves, animals, flowers, mountains, clouds, winds, fires, the night, the dawn, and the pre-dawn. That pre-dawn is very significant. We're going to hear that in Das Verlassene. In fact, they even referred to it as the Murica hour because Murica set so many poems in that pre-dawn period. And by the way, Wolf only set poems from the past. He never set a living composer. This is very different than Brahms or Schubert, who set their friends' poetry. 8, Wolf had such an original approach to rhythm, harmony, and melody. The big influences on him were Beethoven with the seriousness, Schumann's songs in very large part, and also, most importantly, Wagner. 9, his Lieder are so original in being the ultimate unification and balance between poem, voice, and piano. 10, poetry was always primary to him and not secondary to the music. The purpose of the music, he felt, was to enhance every word. Every bar of the music was to be justified by the words. He never wrote a pretty melody for the sake of writing a pretty melody. The vocal and the piano writing had to fit the words. Therefore, the declamation and the accentuation was usually perfect, with the voice almost seeming to be reciting the words. Wolf rarely repeated any words or lines the poet had not written. There are no unessential notes. Everything is compressed to its essence. 11, the piano writing is extremely significant, sometimes like a massive orchestra, sometimes like a string quartet, but never at the expense of the words. There are many layers, therefore it's very polyphonic. The piano writing can merge with or be very separate from the vocal line. Sometimes Wolf's songs have been referred to as the caviar of Lieder because of their tremendous detail and perfection in the setting of the poetry. But I find this a misleading concept. They have great sophistication, but they are highly accessible to anyone. The genius in them is that they have the impeccable detail along with the huge emotional content and depth. Schubert wrote over 600 songs, and these were written consistently from age 17 to 31, 14 years. Schumann wrote 250 songs during periods that totaled only about 3 years. Wolf wrote 250 songs during periods that added up to not much more than 2 total years, since he wrote in these brief, intense spurts. Wolf did not set a poem his predecessors had set unless he believed that they had failed to realize the full potential of the poem. Usually did not set it. This Verlassene Meglein, he didn't intend to set, he said. He said it just came to him, and he loved the Schumann setting. But And he said he just had to keep his own because it came to him. But basically, he doesn't duplicate anyone else unless he thought he could do it better. And in most cases, experts feel he did. Many of Schubert's songs actually can't be considered truly great masterpieces. Nobody could love Schubert more than I, but 600 and some songs in that time period, I can't feel they're all phenomenal masterpieces. Many of Schumann's aren't, much as I love them, but nearly all of Hugo Wolf's 250 are.
So in our first set of Wolf songs, we have Das Verlassene Mägdlein, and the pre-dawn period that George was talking about. It's a maiden who's just going about the business of what people do in the morning, getting the fire ready and getting the house ready. And then suddenly it comes to her that last night she dreamed of the man who has forsaken her. And then her tears start to fall. In Verschwiegene Liebe, the character equates the loveliness of his beloved with that of the night. In Ist's, we welcome spring in, and you'll hear that has such a wonderful piano part that's so joyful. And Abschied is a fun piece. This is the story of a critic who arrives at a man's door. And he says, you know, I have the pleasure of being your critic. And he sort of assesses the man, the critic assesses the man, and sort of checks him out and says, and is looking at his shadow on the wall, and says, now my dear young man, clearly you must know how enormous your nose is. That actually it's a protuberance, and you know, it's unsightly. And the character says, oh my gosh, well I never noticed. I didn't know that my nose was so big. And so when he sort of follows the critic out the door, he decides to give him a little kick down the stairs, and you'll hear it all, and then the character rejoices. It all sounds very silly, but you will follow the story perfectly based on how Wolf said it.
Angeklopft, ein Herr tritt abends bei mir ein.
Ich habe die Ehre, Ihr Rezensent zu sein.
Sofort nimmt das Licht in der Hand, besieht lang meine Schatten an der Wand, nah und fern.
Oh, lieber junger Mann, sehen Sie doch gefälligst mal Ihre Nase von der Seite an. Wie weiter ist, dass das ein Ausdruck ist, was alle Wetter
Gewiss, mein Hase, ich dachte nicht, all mein Lebtage nicht, dass ich so einer Witznase führt im Gesicht. Der Mann sprach noch Verschiedenes hin und her. Ich weiß auf meine Ehre nicht mehr. Meinte vielleicht, ich sollt ihm beichten. Zuletzt stand auf, ich tat ihm leuchten. Der mir unam die Treppe sehnt, da geb ich ihm noch wohlgesinnt einen kleinen Tritt, drüben an mir gesessen mit.
Eine Hage, es war's ein Gerumpel, ein Geputzel, ein Gehumpel.
Hab ich nie gesehen, all mein Lebtage nicht gesehen. Ein Mädchen so rasch die Treppen absehen.
Actually, I'm not going to say anything about the next three songs.
Dein Haus, durchsichtig wie ein Glas, dein Holder, wenn ich nicht allein
We focused on the giants of the Lied, but there are hundreds of other Lieder composers. After all, there's over 8,000 known Lieder. And I'd like to mention just a few others very briefly. Karl Loewe was a contemporary of Schubert's who composed 370 Lieder and was especially famous for his ballads. A ballad is a Lied which is a dramatic narrative. The Erlkönig we heard on Friday night is a ballad. Robert Franz, a contemporary of Schumann and Liszt, who wrote over 300 Lieder. Franz's somewhat younger contemporary, Peter Cornelius, who actually, of his Lieder, wrote the poetry for half of them. This is quite a unique occurrence among Lieder composers. We can't leave out Richard Wagner, who actually wrote 20 Lieder, the most famous of which are the 5 Wesendonck Lieder. Mathilde Wesendonck was a muse to Wagner and was a poet, and he set 5 of her Lieder, and they're quite significant because 2 of them he even entitled sketches for Tristan, which he was working on at that time, and you can hear what eventually went into Tristan in those great Lieder. Kindra Sherrick sings the Wesendonck Lieder fantastically. It isn't well known that Liszt wrote 70 Lieder, actually 100 if we include all the alternative versions that he provided. Only recently have Liszt Lieder been given attention. They're actually getting quite a lot of attention right now, but until even 5-10 years ago, no attention. His songs comprise 6 languages. There's 50 in German, with Goethe and Heine the most often set poets, 13 in French, most often Victor Hugo. Au Conge d'Or is the most famous. 5 in Italian, which include the 3 Petrarch sonnets that were then later arranged for piano that pianists loved to play. Those were originally songs. 1 in Hungarian, 1 in Russian, and 1 in English to the poetry of Tennyson. It reflects Liszt's tremendous cosmopolitan makeup in so many ways. He was not a natural Lieder composer, though. His Lieder really were a little more for the recital or concert hall than the home. And actually, it's said that when he accompanied singers, he drowned them out. There's also frequent errors in the declamation. We often don't realize that while Liszt was of German ancestry, he actually was closest to French culture. He started living in Paris when he was 13, and that was his base of operations all the way through age 36. So if he had a choice to write a letter, he would write it in French for the rest of his life, and he related to French culture. Even during the Franco-Prussian War, his sympathies lay with the French. And even though he grew up in Hungary, he never was able to speak much Hungarian at all. A few thoughts on Liszt the man. I think he's the most misunderstood of all composers. He's thought insincere and superficial, and it's just nonsense. He was a very complex person, a very conflicted one, and many contradictory aspects. He jokingly called himself half gypsy and half Franciscan. He craved solitude, but was a man of the world. He had a profound and intense interest in all aspects of life and death. At heart, he really was a spiritual seeker. The preface to his solo piano album, Years of Pilgrimage, said in his own words, he was, quote, seeking the intrinsic poetic meaning of things. I find that title significant also. There we are again, journeying, traveling, but in a spiritual journey, even using the word pilgrimage. Liszt saw the artist's role as transforming and uplifting society and felt there was an obligation for artists to do so. But what dominated his life above all was serious and intense religious devotion. From early childhood, he'd wanted to be a priest. His father had been in seminary but left in order to marry, and thank goodness, produced their only child, Franz. As a teenager, Liszt had the desire to returned very intensively to enter the priesthood. I'm very thankful for the priest in Paris who talked him out of it, who told him his duty was to be the musician. But finally, in his 50s, Liszt did enter 4 minor orders of the priesthood. It's often forgotten. He retired from performing for any income at age 36. He would live till age 75, never again played for any income, never again really practiced. He had such a phenomenal ear that when he would play a few benefit concerts, he would simply be able to sit right down and play what he hadn't practiced for years. When he retired from concertizing, he moved to Weimar, where Goethe and Schiller had been. And it was really sort of a new Athens, that this would be such a phenomenal cultural center, and there was the desire after those great writers were gone. If Liszt came back there, then he could be part of a renaissance for Weimar. And Liszt loved the idea, after all the touring all over Europe, to have a peaceful, quiet place, and he envisioned it working out very idyllically. He was there for over 10 years, but it didn't work out idyllically. His music program was given a hard time, and finally figured enough of this. I want to go to Rome. That's my real heart anyway. And I don't really have a home since I grew up in Hungary, and I'm of German background, and I then really grew up in Paris, and then I toured the world. And then spent time in Weimar where I wasn't really totally happy. And I want to enter the priesthood to this limited extent. I'm not a Catholic, but I understand there's 7 levels of the priesthood, and what was appropriate for him were 4 levels of that. So Rome became his headquarters at the age of 51, and for the next 25 years, he spent half the year there, then 3 months of the year in Budapest, because the Hungarians said, you are a Hungarian, if you'd be the president of our conservatory, you can be sort of the figurehead and the fundraiser, we won't give you any administrative functions, so he felt that was a duty. And then Weimar said, why don't you come back and give master classes? So he spent 3 months of the year, 3 days of the week, giving master classes there where the great pianists of the world came and attended. He never charged for those also. The dominant trait of the last half of his life was selflessness, generosity, kindness, and supportiveness. His conscious motto was caritas, or charity. Why the negative image? Liszt was zealous, eager, intensely enthusiastic, and he really came on a little too strong to people. He made people like Chopin, who was a very private person, uncomfortable. And we have to realize Liszt was a flamboyant Hungarian Catholic. That doesn't quite fit in those days to the establishment in the parts of Germany that were Protestant or conservative musical circles like Leipzig and Vienna. There was also professional jealousy, other pianists so envious of the success that he'd had. His music is incredibly autobiographical, much as Schumann's was. And it's interesting, neither was really accepted as significant composers in their time. Liszt wrote over 1,000 works. Even of the piano music, which has, 500 or something works, 5 or 10% of that is well known. We don't really know his symphonic poems, his Faust Symphony, the Dante Symphony, the oratorios, and literally hundreds of pieces of church music. What really devastated him was that he wasn't accepted as a composer. I think in some ways it's occurred to me, maybe it's a bit like Leonard Bernstein. There's a massively talented musical missionary who was a flamboyant performer and really wanted to be seen as a composer, but the world only wanted to see that that was a performer. Liszt's reputation, I think, has further been ruined by so many bad performances. I don't know any composer that has nearly the number of bad performances that happened to Liszt. Excessive banging, excessive speed, excessive emoting. I mean, using it as a vehicle to show off. It needs drama, it needs ardor, it needs commitment, but it needs beauty, nobility, and a sincere tenderness. If you want to learn more on Liszt, I really recommend the Alan Walker 3-volume biography. It's a sensational book. I couldn't put it down, and it really reads very fast. But anything you need to know about Liszt is there. He also has some supplementary books of material he found after those books were written. But Alan Walker is the person for Liszt in the world today. Everything is there. There's also an article on my website that has more detail than I went into today, although it's a little more oriented for pianists, but it does cover aspects of Liszt. We're going to perform these 3 lieder of Liszt that really represent the 3 facets of Liszt. The love, that was such an important part of who he was, with the Liebesdrama. No, wrong. The O Lieb. Liebesdrama was the piano piece that Liszt made out of the song, but it was a song first. Then the Hungarian gypsy element. Liszt absolutely loved the gypsies. He'd go out and hang out with their bonfires and their dances, and he loved the fact that they were improvisers. In fact, sometimes he would stay so long, he cut it close to get back to concerts that he was supposed to give. He just was absolutely fascinated by their music, and we can hear the Csárdás in this. We can hear some of the Hungarian scales, and it permeates a lot of his music, not just Hungarian rhapsodies or a piece like this. In this poem by Linnau, who was the most depressive of all the romantic poets, it describes these 3 different gypsies and how they pass the time. The one plays music, one smokes his pipe, and one sleeps. And Linnau says, this gives us some thoughts about life. And the vocal line is almost spoken at times, and the piano has these many Hungarian elements. And finally, we conclude with the real Liszt, the spiritual side, with your Glocken von Marling. Marling is in southern Tyrol, near where the poet lived. Liszt himself always loved bells, especially when he was in Rome. He couldn't get enough absorbing all the sounds of the bells. And this is a very delicate meditation. It's so ethereal, so beautiful. And you can hear in it why Liszt was such a big influence on Debussy, Ravel, and many, many other composers. This is the 150th anniversary of Richard Strauss's birth. He may not have been the spiritual seeker Liszt and Mahler were, but he had insights into human nature with the best of any opera composers. And it's unfortunate most of his 15 operas are not well known. He could portray anything in life and the world in musical terms, and he knew as well as anyone in history how to write for the voice. Most of his 200 lieder were intended for the soprano voice, frequently that of his wife, Pauline. A large number of his lieder were written early in his life, and many of his most popular ones date from this period. Some of his lieder were written with piano, were later orchestrated, and some were written with the orchestra in mind from the start. Mention should be made of his last work, the 4 Last Songs for soprano and orchestra, written at the age of 85. 3 of those songs are settings of the poetry of Hermann Hesse, and 1 to that of Eichendorff. These will be performed by the San Diego Symphony on February 6, 7, and 8. It's a glorious work.
We'll start our set with Morgan, one of the most ethereal and beautiful Swiss leaders, and continue on to Allerseelen, All Souls Day. The person in the song is setting the table and making everything ready to greet her beloved on this one day a year where all the souls rise. And so she speaks about their love, when they fell in love once in May. She says, give me your hand that I may once more squeeze it, and if somebody sees, why should I care? You know, give me only just one of your sweet looks like once in May. So she's remembering her beloved and on this special day, really recommuning with him.
By now, the Lied has grown so large. Once performed only in homes, it now needs larger venues and it needs professionals to perform it. The orchestra is now starting to replace the piano as accompanist. One of the great ingredients of the Lied was its intimacy with only the piano as accompaniment. But beauty is certainly not lost when the Lied moves to the concert hall with orchestral accompaniment, but it becomes a slightly different genre. Lieder have continued to be written. Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern wrote them, and Hans Pfitzner wrote many in a very conservative style. But the world had changed. The great Lieder were products of the Romantics, and Romanticism was completely dead after World War I. This is not because Germany was defeated in World War I. Our world today shows little interest in the French songs of Fauré and Debussy, the English songs of Vaughan Williams, or the Russian songs of Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. Lieder were dependent on nature and on people taking time to reflect on nature and on the spiritual. Our urban technological society has lost much of its connection with nature and the habit of going inward. I see the endangered status of Lieder as symptomatic of that. But all is not lost. The wonders of the internet make it possible for anyone to hear and even see Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, Christa Ludwig, Janet Baker, Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, and many others, even from earlier times than those. We can buy CDs. We can support the few Lieder recitals that do occur. And of course, there'll be one here in this room at this moment 1 week from now. You're supporting it by being here tonight as we try and bring Lieder alive. We also can realize that in its pure form, Lieder with voice and piano are a product of a past age. But the Lied has permeated the orchestra, and we still hear the Mahler symphonies. We hear Das Lied von der Erde. We hear the Strauss Four Last Songs. The Lied has inspired songs in other languages. And when you're playing a Brahms intermezzo or a Schubert impromptu, in a way you are playing a Lied. Without the Lied, the course of Western European music would have been very different. We are nearing the end of our journey together exploring the Lied. I wish to thank the Athenaeum for the opportunity to share our thoughts and music. I wish to thank each one of you here for your responsiveness and receptivity. Musical communication is dependent on both performer and listener. And I believe a response to a performance, or indeed all art, says more about the responder than the performer or author. Your having responded to Lieder shows that you value and respond to qualities that have made it great, the spiritual depth and the tender intimacy. I also want to thank those of you who heard us in our first collaborative efforts together and urged us to continue. That played a big part in our deciding to do that. You know who you are. I wish to acknowledge those who first opened my ears to Lieder. Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau in 1966, when I heard my first Schubert Die Schöne Müllerin. It was in DAR Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. It has nearly 4,000 seats. So it shows even in a big venue, though not ideal, Lieder can still reach listeners. It's interesting, it was a sold-out hall, too. Then my first Schumann Dichterlied I heard in Aspen in 1968 by John McCullum. And the pianist was Brooks Smith. What a musician he was. I didn't know that a couple years later I would be in his accompanying class at the Eastman School. Hearing him really proved to me that's how I wanted to play. Even if I were playing solo music, he made the piano sing, and he was a beautiful man. He later on came out to USC. He was Heifetz's accompanist. In the fall of '69 at the Eastman School, Janet Baker gave me my first opportunity to hear Gretchen am Spinnrad. I've never forgotten that, and her communicative skill that evening made a profound impression. In fact, I still have the poster. I asked the school once the recital was over if I could have the poster they'd had up, and that's still in my possession. There was a German teacher on the Eastman faculty, Jesse Kneisel, and I was a very mediocre German student, as you can tell by any pronunciations I've made of German words. But her love of America, I'd never heard America before then. I'd heard of Wolf, but I didn't really know who he was. But she planted a seed that now has blossomed decades later. I find it very interesting. Teachers never know what seeds they plant and when they may take root. My next 45 years after that were spent almost exclusively as a solo pianist. My musical lifetime has had many journeys as a player and listener, but the collaboration with Kinder Sherrick, mostly in Lieder, over the past 10 months is right up there with the top ones. It's been a privilege to brainstorm with her, rehearse with her, and perform with her. It adds a lot to collaborate with someone you personally respect. Some musicians who play together because they're professionals can still give a successful performance if they don't feel close, but it adds so much more when you do have warm feelings for someone and personally respect them as a musician as well as person. She's not Fischer Dieskau, who spent decades performing thousands of Lieder, and putting together a set of 3 concerts like this would have been quite easy for him or someone who performed around the world for decades and lived with the Lieder a long time. We learned of our doing this series here 3 months ago, and actually 60% of the Lieder that has been performed she learned for this project for you to hear tonight. I once saw a very famous person, mainly their career was in opera, and I don't want to say who, but they performed an entire vocal recital with music. There's nothing wrong with that. But I commend this artist for internalizing all the music she has very recently and in very close succession of these 3 nights. And this project is not all she's been doing. A week before she came down here, she performed much of the Lieder of Schoenberg in San Francisco, and her piano at home in San Francisco has scores for upcoming operatic performances on it that Lieder have taken time from her doing. I thank Kirk Eichelberger. He has his own career to tend, but he's spent so much time giving us his counsel, his advice, listening to us rehearse, giving me suggestions, giving suggestions to Kendra Sherrick, and I've enjoyed so much performing with him, which I've done for the first time just tonight here. I'd like to acknowledge Maxine Bernstein in San Francisco, who founded a wonderful organization entitled Lieder Alive. You can look up its website and read all that she's doing. Her dedication to the cause of Lieder and her encouragement for us to go out and spread the word is very meaningful. Most of all, I want to thank my wife, Susan. There's always an unsung hero behind the scenes in any project, and she's it in this venture. No one can know all that she's done. Her knowledge, her musicianship are part of our performance tonight, as well as thousands of drudgery and meaningful things that she's done to make everything happen. I remember when I was doing my very long dissertation, Menahem Pressler, my teacher at Indiana, said, if this marriage can survive your dissertation, George, it can survive anything. Susan was so integrally involved with that. She even ghost wrote a few pages and edited the whole thing and typed it multiple times. Some of you have seen it. It's about 1,000 pages long. And this has almost been kind of a rerun of that, demanding enormous patience as well as collaborative work in a way that you don't get to see on stage. And I really thank her for 39 years of devotion to me and our mutual devotion to music. And Lieder has always really been about sharing intimate personal feelings through word and music in a home environment and with friends. At age 63 that I am, I realized I've outlived 9 of the 12 composers that are on our programs these last nights. One always realizes they could be doing a swan song. Should this be mine, I know of nothing more meaningful than to have dealt with this great music, these composers I love so much, and to have done it with my wife and 2 artists I admire so much, and to have shared it with you, my dear neighbors and friends in this city that I love so much. The subjects in Lieder are the same ones that obsessed Mahler throughout his life and are reflected in his music, life, death, and love. The Lied was at the heart of Mahler's music. He united symphony and song in 3 ways. He composed Lieder with orchestral accompaniment. He put songs into symphonies. Was there's das Lied von der Erde, which in a way is a symphony, but in a way it's a song cycle. In a way, that's the ultimate Lied. Everything in Romanticism for 100 years is in that work. And he put the aesthetics of the Lied into the symphony. Mahler thought orchestrally when composing his accompaniments. He usually wrote them out for the piano, but he was not a pianist and he didn't write in pianistic terms. And then he usually later orchestrated them. There's about 40 Lieder. I'll just give an overview what's there. There's 24 from Das Knaben Wunderhorn, a massive collection from 1805 of folk music and poetry. And half that 24 were written for piano in the 1880s and stayed for piano, and half were written for orchestra after the turn of the century. There's the 4 songs of a wayfarer, written for piano in the 1880s, later orchestrated. Kirk sings those. There are 10 songs Lieder on poems of Rückert. Rückert was a very special poet, a professor of Oriental languages, and his poetry is known for being very introspective and meditative. There are 5 Kindertoten Lieder, originally written for a chamber orchestra, and Kirk is going to sing those up in San Francisco on May 17, I believe it is. And then there are the 5 Ruckert songs, written 1901 to 2, originally for piano, and then orchestrated. Henry Sherrick will sing all 5 of those in June up in San Francisco. We will end our presentation with one of the Ruckert Lieder, Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen, I am lost to the world. This has been called, quote, arguably the most sublime Lied, a miracle of transcendental feeling, the last great Lied for voice and piano, Mahler's greatest song. Mahler certainly identified with this work, saying it expressed his very self. The Romantic poets initially believed they could transform all of society. That proved to be impossible, but they gave each of us a vehicle which we as individuals can utilize to aim to heal our lives. That is what these 3 evenings have been about to me and what classical music is about. We hope you in your lives may be able to more often experience what the poet of this sublime Lied says at its conclusion. We're not going to do an encore tonight. Nothing should follow Ruckert's words or Mahler's music. We're not going to do a Q&A tonight. We know it's getting late. But do contact us by phone or by email if there's any questions on Lieder. And don't feel obligated to stand in the line to greet us. If you need to get home, I know it's late, feel free to do that, or if you just feel like meditating on the music that you've heard, we understand completely. I'd like to have the final words from Kirk, who has sung this Lied, as well as Kendra, and has quite a deep understanding of Mahler. And I thought you would enjoy not hearing from a pianist, but hearing from somebody who's internalized the work themselves.
Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen. This is the end. There is a reason that there will not be an encore, because this is the encore. And that's because the words and the sentiment of this song communicate exactly the idea we would like to leave you with. As artists, we have separated ourselves from the cares and concerns of the world around us, and have found a home with those things we truly love and care about. For us, that is in our art and the beauty inherent in our music. The words of this song say, I have become lost to the world, and that is right, because it has been some time since I have interacted with the world on its terms. In fact, the poem ends with these profound words. I am dead to the tumult of the world, and I rest in a quiet realm. Ich lebe allein in meinem Himmel. I live alone in my heaven. In meinem Lieben, in my love. In meinem Lied.